Shalom from Jerusalem. This is TV7's Israel at War update. And as we're set to deliberate the latest developments here in Israel, throughout the region and beyond, with chief focus, of course, on the anticipated strike against Iran over its belligerent attack against Israel some 2 weeks ago, it's always important to remember how this war began. 375 days ago, on October 7th of last year, the Islamist Hamas and its terror affiliates in the Gaza Strip launched a surprise onslaught on southern Israel, declaring war by perpetrating a massacre, murdering some 1,200 mostly civilians, wounding over 4,800 others, and kidnapping 247 people, including elderly, men, women, children, and infants. 101 of them remain in Hamas captivity to date. The subsequent day, on October 8th of last year, Iran essentially joined the war by greenlighting its proxy Hezbollah to launch cross-border attacks against Israel. Since then, the Iranian proxy in Lebanon has launched over 12,000 projectiles towards Israeli territory, and not this Iranian proxy in Lebanon alone. In addition to Hezbollah, proxies in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, including Iran proper, have launched direct attacks against Israel. And with that, let's now turn to our TV7 editor-at-large, Mr. Amir Oren. Jerusalem is at the height of preparations for the execution of a retaliatory strike. What can you tell us about that?
So obviously the military plans have been refined and options presented to the war cabinet. There are several reasons for waiting some more time. There is no urgency. Israel, in principle, has decided that it must retaliate. According to foreign media, Prime Minister Netanyahu has promised President Biden that the target list will not include either the nuclear infrastructure facilities or the oil industry, but there is another menu out of which Israel can pick and choose many targets. It can come at them through many methods, and it doesn't hurt that the Iranians are on edge, waiting for the shoe to drop on them. Now, fighting goes on in both Gaza and Lebanon. In Gaza, there are firefights from Rafah in the south to Jabalia and other places in the north, sometimes with IDF casualties. In South Lebanon, at the so-called line of contact, even though this is a term used by India and Pakistan in Kashmir, the line of contact in the Lebanese-Israeli context is the facilities, mostly underground, which Hezbollah prepared for the penultimate, the almost last stage before the assault they planned. However, the most important news recently in Israel is what happens inland. Terrorism in Israel today on one of the main highways, some 30 kilometers north of Gaza, probably someone from Gaza who either infiltrated long ago or overstayed their work permit. And Israel is now working feverishly to perfect its anti-drone defense following the killing 2 days ago, day before yesterday, of 4 infantry soldiers in their home base.
With regard to the counter-drone or counter-UAS systems, naturally there are many various systems in Israel's defense industries, and the defense ministry just needs to take whatever is off the shelf in order to utilize those capabilities in full effect. But unfortunately, it was not done to date, and it should have been done long ago, in my opinion.
But at least one of our guests can speak much more authoritatively than I am able to on it. But I am told by Air Force officials that the problem is not to intercept, but to detect and discover.
Indeed.
This very elusive target.
Indeed. Well, before we touch on that, let's turn to Madrid, Spain, where we're joined by Dr. Rafael Bardaghi, formerly Spain's national security advisor, and right now the CEO of Worldwide Strategy. It's always a pleasure, Rafael. I'd like to
My
touch
pleasure.
specifically, the pleasure's all ours. I'd like to touch specifically on the anticipated strike against Iran. Is there something that Israel needs to maintain within its calculation when we're talking about the strategic outlook to such an attack? It's not just merely an attack, it's an opportunity in order to gain certain steps at the expense of the Iranians, of course, at a time also when we're seeing the European Union in concert with Britain coming and slapping the Iranians with additional sanctions over their delivery of munitions to Russia for their war of aggression against Ukraine.
Well, I have to say, Jonathan, that I agree entirely with what Amir said before, that there is no rush, there is no need to rush for Israel to execute an attack that has been promised. So I have no doubt that Israel at some point, at some day, will retaliate against Iran. But sincerely, and being pragmatic, we are 3 weeks away from the US presidential elections. I think that from a politician perspective, as a prime minister perspective, this is the best window of opportunity to extract goodies, concessions, and many things that may be on the list, on the shopping list of the IDF from the United States, even political commitments to defend Israel in case of another attack. So I think it will be prudent to assume that there are negotiations between the government in Jerusalem and the White House and the center of powers in Washington to arrive to some kind of a consensus that may benefit better Israel if it waits for an attack than if it's attacking as soon as we can imagine in the next days. So I would argue that there is no need to launch an attack nowadays. That will be much better for Israel to negotiate with Americans some concessions instead of going right away against the oil or the nuclear infrastructure. And then who knows what will happen in November. And also, there is no need to launch an all-out attack against Iran. There could be successive attacks, first on some symbolic targets, then the most probably harmful to today's regime is the oil industry. So there is no need to take any decision right away, I think.
Keep the casus belli at play, of course, is something that is within the calculation. But let's turn to Washington, D.C., where we're joined by retired Brigadier General Mark Kimmett, formerly the Assistant Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs. It's good to see you, General. I'd like to ask you particularly, it's always a pleasure as well. I'd like to ask you specifically on what Dr. Bardaghi just mentioned and Mr. Owen. There is much room for Israel to maneuver. Of course, it is currently engaged in a seven-front war. One of those fronts is the Islamic Republic of Iran. Nevertheless, the high-intensity front is currently in Lebanon, where Israel is seeking to establish a certain demilitarized zone from at least Hezbollah infrastructure, taking away its capacity from launching a surprise attack in the future. Should Israel potentially deepen its operational freedoms within the context of American constraints in order to basically bolster the current high-intensity warfare conducted in Lebanon rather than engage in a new theater?
Well, I think everyone is correct. This is not the time for Israel to be striking at Iran. The fact remains that there is time to do it. Iran is not going anywhere. The cause belli is not going anywhere. So clearly the administration is signaling, we don't want you to do this before the election in a serious kind of way. You can always do this after the election. I think, candidly, Netanyahu would prefer Trump, who would give a lot more leash to Netanyahu to carry out whatever he wanted to do. But the fact remains is that this president doesn't want to have foreign policy, or this administration doesn't want foreign policy to be part of the presidential elections. You could see that when President Biden was able to talk the Longshoremen's Union into stopping their strike until after the election. And he's doing the same thing on behalf of Vice President Harris to ensure that we don't have the big war or anything that we characterize as the October surprise. Now, Lebanon is a bit different. There are no American troops at risk except for those that are coming in to support the THAAD battery. There doesn't seem to be a lot of concern about the level of intensity that is conducted, the level of war intensity that's conducted inside of Lebanon. So I don't think unless Iran uses that as a pretext for another attack on Israel, that the United States really is concerned about the intensity of the war inside of Lebanon right now between now and the election.
Indeed. Well, let's turn to central Israel, where we're joined by Brigadier General in Reserve Yaron Rosen, formerly the IDF Chief of Cyber Staff, an Israeli Air Force commander, as well as a fighter pilot. It's always a pleasure, Yaron. I'd like to ask you particularly on the Israeli angle. Naturally, as Mr. Oren initially stated, Israel is committed to strike at Iran. Nevertheless, matters of timing are, of course, crucial within the calculations. Keep the Iranians on edge, putting them in a certain of a psychological warfare, utilize potentially some cyber offensive tools behind the scenes to frustrate the Iranians, but at the same time, prosecute the intended high-intensity war potentially in Lebanon, and even evaluate various activities in the Gaza Strip and elsewhere.
Yeah, Jonathan, fighting a long-distance war, along and in parallel with close wars, like close border wars with Lebanon in the south and Gaza, and everything that's going on internally, as Amir described. These are very different types of war fighting. Israel is a regional power, no more than that, respectfully. And it's not easy for any country to fight 1,000 miles away from home. The United States, after 9/11, if we remember how long it takes to, send the forces and force buildup and all these things before going into Afghanistan, it takes time. And same here, basically. We're fighting with what we have. There are defensive options and offensive options, but it's not the same as going into Gaza or going into Lebanon. It's very, very different. So we have to keep that in mind, how unique this effort is. And with that, because of the distance, there are some elements of war that are not to consider, because the element of surprise, everybody's talking about the retaliation. Okay, so the exact time is not known, but you need a surprise somehow, but it's coming. So the other side is sort of waiting, and then we're going to wait for them. So it's sort of a very strange intercourse of a sort of a discussion with fire between two nations, and it's a slower pace. Right? We're thinking, let's see what happens. What do they think? What do we think? What do we need? What's it doing in our favor for deterrence? So all of these things, I want to point out just a few things that I think moving forward in the next few days or weeks, given the political landscape as well, that was previously discussed. It's never a good time. There's always like, oh, it's not a good time now, it's not a good time later. It's never a good time to fight a war. Israel has its own needs, and it needs to protect its citizens. And yes, there are internal discussions, and there's the elections. There are the elections in the U.S. And yes, there are things that you need to think about going into this last month before the elections in the U.S. Definitely. But there are needs for the war. So there are other options, which I'm not hearing. I don't know if this is considered, but I would expect to have diplomatic retaliations. What about taking something which Iran is actually the goal of the Iranian offensive, long-term offensive against Israel, to eliminate Israel as a nation state? What about recognizing Israel's eastern border as the final border? Just wake up tomorrow morning and let's say the whole Western community is giving Israel that and telling Israel with the military retaliation, just wait a bit. That could be quite a blow to Iran. And there are other options, like recognizing that South Lebanon, from whatever parallel to whatever parallel, whether it's the Litani or the Awali or whatever, is a DMZ. Just saying that is a diplomatic retaliation. And we need to move around these realms between the politics, the diplomacy, economics, military, a little bit more free, in a more flexible way to use this whole area for our advantage. I think that's where I would focus the next moves.
Thank you, General Rosen. I'd like to now jump from one theater to another. Each one will focus on a different theater. We don't have very much time for that, so let's keep it as short and to the point as possible. Mr. Owen, let's focus on the Gaza Strip. Right now, there are no negotiations behind the scenes with regard to the hostages. Where are we heading from here? Is there some light at the end of the tunnel?
Well, on June the 2nd, 1967, and this ties into what Yaron just said and to your question, Moshe Dayan was the newly appointed defense minister, and he had a very difficult task to surprise out of a crisis where the entire world is watching. So when asked when is Israel going to attack Egypt, he said it's both too late and too early. 3 days later, the Six-Day War began. So this has to do with the Iran operation, but also with the way Yahya Sinwar probably sees the hostage crisis. Having not negotiated in good faith for the last several months, right now, in the run-up to the elections, he's probably going to wait until November.
Indeed. Dr. Barrahi, I'd like to focus on the Lebanese front. What can you tell us from a strategic perspective? But at the same time, there is an issue, of course, with UNIFIL. Israel has asked a number of the posts to withdraw just temporarily in order to avoid any type of direct harm to UNIFIL personnel. Unfortunately, this has brought about some backlash out of Europe.
Well, let me say, personally, I consider UNIFIL a disgrace. It never wanted to put in motion the practices and the procedures to achieve the goal of the mission, which was dismantling Hezbollah military capabilities south of the Litani River. Never did that. It became trapped in a kind of strange symbiotic relation between the blue helmets and Hezbollah fighters and the Lebanese army. And now they claim and they cry because, there are tanks around some of the facilities where Hezbollah has been building underground infrastructure, with them, keeping a blind eye or looking into another direction. I think it is time for the United Nations to withdraw UNIFIL entirely. I know that with the Secretary General Guterres, which is much in favor of Hamas and Hezbollah, it's not going to happen. But sincerely, from a country that is part of UNIFIL, if I were defense minister in Spain, I will bring all my boys home and I will consider the mission ended, period. And I think Israel should enforce 1701 and 1509 by itself, as it's doing now in the south of Lebanon. And that's the only thing, because the United Nations have never played in favor of Israel, and it will never add any inch of security or extra security to Israel. Israel has to defend itself, as it's doing in south of Lebanon.
Well, 1701 is most relevant to Israel. I think 1559 will deal with the core of the issue, namely the Taif Accords, which is obviously vital to dismantle all the militias in Lebanon and for once and for all to provide the Lebanese military, the Lebanese armed forces, with the tools to assert sovereignty and finally allow a functioning government to operate in Lebanon for the sake and the betterment of the Lebanese people. But General Kimmett, I'd like to ask you about Iraq. We saw, on the one hand, an IRGC deputy Quds Force commander receiving two major processions in Nawaf and other areas in Iraq. At the same time, Hashd Shabi is gaining ground at the expense of the more nationalist militias in that country. Is Iran expected to further deepen its influence in that country at the expense also of the United States and the West at large?
Yeah, two things. First of all, any notion that you're going to dismantle a militia, I think is just fantasy. I'm not sure you could point to any militias in the Middle East that have been dismantled over the last 50 years. In fact, John Abizaid always had a great saying. He said, militias are the curse of the Middle East. Now, going over to Iraq, I think it's got to be understood that Prime Minister Soudani is between a rock and a hard place, literally. He's got Iran on one side, a geographic neighbors that have been there for 1,000 years, so they can't be ignored. And they have the West, primarily led by the U.S., on the other side, trying to push for reforms, trying to push them for a more assertive policy against Iran. I think it is not unfair to be somewhat sympathetic to Prime Minister Soudani as he's trying to balance all these requirements. I don't necessarily think the Hashid are getting any stronger inside of Iraq, but they certainly are not being withdrawn or reduced or demobilized in any case. I think it's just it's a factor that has to be accepted inside of Iraq. The best that the West can do is try to moderate and mitigate the influence of Iran and those militias inside of Iraq. We haven't been doing a very good job of it, but the alternative of just pulling out and saying halas is not an option. Nor for that matter is the option of putting so much pressure on Prime Minister Soudani that it causes a collapse of his government.
Indeed. Well, sanctions have been always a good tool to operate against Iran in order to, once enforced, diminish its capacity on the Iraqi Hashd Shabi rather than the Iraqi government. But that's, of course, my opinion in the matter. General Rosen, I'd like to ask you specifically on the Red Sea. What can be done right now? Of course, the United States recently had a more robust response to an attack by the Houthis against a UK vessel. But it seems like they are announcing that they plan on even bolstering their attacks, not only against commercial vessels, but against U.S. and Israeli vessels in particular. Of course, whatever they say and whatever happens on the ground doesn't always converge, but that's a different story. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think, it didn't work until now. And I think the attacks that Israel and the recent one that was done by the coalition, namely the US, is a good example. But for some reason, this is not working and not deterring the Houthis. Now, the question is, how do we change this? And how do we put regional interests stronger in play? And I think one direction that we should be thinking about is involving Egypt. Egypt is losing 20%, at least 20% of its Suez Canal money from the shipping industry that has been turned to go around the Cape in Africa. So the main one that's losing a lot of money each year from this ongoing situation is Egypt. So the question is, how can we pull Egypt inside and create a situation that there is a regional coalition, including not only Europeans and the US and Israel, but including Egypt, who has an interest in this game. So something in that area, and actually placing forces in the Bab el-Mandab and the Straits of Bab el-Mandab, just as the Iranians have their front post on a ship in the Straits of Bab el-Mandab, which is absolutely unimaginable to me that we haven't retaliated directly at them, is something that we should think about. So basically, that's the direction I would take, to build a different construct with regional players in the game.
Half a sentence each. What is the outlook for the next 24 hours? Mr. Owen, we'll start with you.
Why don't I try to predict what happened in the last 24 hours? The Iranians have been caught red-handed in trying to recruit Israelis to perform various espionage and sabotage missions, including the assassination of a senior Israeli figure whose identity they didn't tell them until they have the first missions fulfilled. But it's quite a worrisome development.
Dr. Bardaki?
Well, I think we need to pay attention to the potential more growing terrorist attacks inside Israel. I think the Shin Bet, the Shabak, will have to do the best to avoid more terrorist attacks with casualties. But that's the way that maybe Sinwar and others may try to use in the next days.
General Kimmett?
Well, probably the most important thing going on in America is the playoff series for baseball. The Cardinals will be playing the Yankees. That will probably be the most focused thing that both American citizens and the American policymakers will be looking at today.
Well, I'll get updated from you, since the first and last baseball game I ever visited was with General Kimmett. But nonetheless, General Rosen?
Well, while the baseball game is in play, I would aim at the 9th inning for the surprise attack on Iran.
Indeed. Well, that's all the time that we have for today. I'd like to thank General Rosen, General Kimmett, and Dr. Bardaki, as well as Mr. Owen, of course. I'd like to thank all of you at home as well. Until our next update from here in Jerusalem, Shalom.
My name is Doron Gavish, and my background, 30 years of serving in the Israeli Air Force. My last job, I was the commander of the Israeli Air and Missile Defense during the introduction of the Iron Dome to the defense of Israel. All of this allows me really to be part of the team here in TV7. It is super important to have such a platform. We talk about the global situation, we talk about Israel, and those different angles which are relevant to the discussion.
TV7 Israel invites you to watch and hear some of the most knowledgeable experts, most of whom partook in creating policies shaping this region today. Join us for Jerusalem Studio.